Alice Treves, welcome back to the How Humans Work podcast.
Thank you, Jef Szi. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. I know this is a little bit more spontaneous, and this is a show where we're going to explore the connection between negative thinking habits and IFS parts, and maybe some archetypal wisdom. This really is an outgrowth of our conversation we've been having with the little social media project we are doing, exploring little bits of wisdom to try to share with people, particularly young people, coming of age people. And that's in process. But we've been having this great conversation around negative thinking habits. So this is something you've been working with for a while. Maybe a good place to start is to talk about how you started as a psychotherapist, identifying the need to work with people's thought patterns and negative thinking, and how that came about for you as part of your work.
Yes, great. Okay. I don't have a super reliable memory, so I don't know that I can really accurately source where it came from, but I know it evolved in my practice, and it's been over 10 years where, to start to see that there are patterns that people fall into, that they tell themselves certain things, and there's certain kind of habitual grooves. And I think this fits really well with neurobiology as well, that, neurons that fire together, wire together, and that we can get into certain patterns of negative thinking and reinforce that and just kind of naturally fall back into that. And so it was really helpful to find a book when I was primarily working with teenagers, but I feel like it absolutely applies to adults as well, to find a book that breaks down, in their field of view, 9 general habits that people fall into. And the more I've explored this with people, and I tend to check in with my clients, it's one of the earlier things in our treatment process that we do is like, okay, well, which one of these do you relate to? Which one of these do you primarily relate to? Oftentimes people relate to more than one.
Mhm.
So
Great.
that's the general background of that. And I have my own that I relate to as well.
Yeah, we'll get into the 9
Hmm.
habits, but I want to start with the word negative and what makes them negative. And I'll just tell you what I'm thinking, which is that
Yeah.
when we think these way and we think in these habits, that we don't necessarily see them as negative, that's not in our view,
Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
impact is negative. So it's not so
Yes.
much that thinking about a certain thing is automatically, oh, I'm a negative person. It's
Hmm.
more of the impact. Is that kind of how you understand it, or is it a little different from that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You're not, when you're in it, you're not thinking, it feels in its own way, kind of like parts, and I know we'll get to that as well, but in its own way, it feels helpful and a kind of essential to, think this way, and
Great.
certainly familiar.
Yeah.
Yes, right. But the
Uh-huh.
impact can be negative because there's usually a misperception that's happening.
Okay.
Another way that I like to think about it is like it's a lens that you're viewing, a situation through, or your life through, or a future event through. And it's just not always an accurate portrayal. It's not an accurate lens.
Mhm. So let's
So
start
there's,
getting into at least some of the 9, in terms
yeah.
of, use an example that when you're in it, it feels like it's trying to be, maybe use the word helpful, or it's familiar at least.
Yeah.
So let's explore one of the 9 and just dive in there.
Sure, great. So I think the easiest one for me to kind of explore is the one that I tend to gravitate towards the most, and lots of people that I work with as well, because it really correlates with anxiety, is the catastrophizing habit. And so, you and I have done some thinking on the brain, and how we have this predictive processor here. And so one of the ways that we can predict is kind of a negative thought bias, or a negative, projection into the future of, okay, the very worst case scenario could happen. And so that's catastrophizing. That's the tendency to fall into the habit of immediately, something unfamiliar, or, feels, scary is coming in the future, and the fear the fear associated with it is that you then gravitate in your mind to the very worst case scenario.
Hmm. Like we're going to go to the beach and I'm going to get caught in a riptide and drown.
Yeah. Yeah. Or we're going to go to the beach and a tsunami, there's going to be a tsunami there. The
At
more,
that level, I mean, I'm laughing a little bit because it seems
yeah.
super extreme, but for some people, that's how they experience their thoughts like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think a very common one is, transportation on an airplane. We have a couple family members that really have that fear of like, it's going to be the one time, although it's pretty rare statistically, it's going to be the one time that like, and, plane crash happens.
Okay, great.
That's,
So you have a client, patient who's beginning treatment and
mhm.
they identify catastrophizing. And so what's really the help or the work that one can do to start working with a deeply grooved pattern of catastrophizing?
Yes, great. Well, the older we are, the more worn the groove can be, right? The more familiar, the more that we can just kind of like easily slip into that. And so the younger you are, I think the more flexibility, more neuroplasticity there can be in terms of making some shifts there. So that's good news. The other good news is neuroplasticity happens throughout our lifetime. So we can make that shift. And as with anything, when it comes to personal change, I think the first step is always awareness. So becoming aware of the pattern that you're in, and that's why I really like naming it, and that fits into the kind of name it to tame it. That once you notice that you're doing it and you have a name for it, you're not caught in the habit in the same way. You have a little bit of distance from it. So first step, there's the three C's, and you and I have been talking about maybe adding a fourth one that relates to parts.
Yeah.
But the first step is to catch it. The
Okay.
first C is to catch it. So you catch yourself
Yeah.
doing it and you name it
Okay.
along with that.
So
So,
I'm driving down the road in the car and all of a sudden I'm doing this plane, I'm going to the airport, I'm driving down and I'm like, this is going to be the crash. This is the time it's going to
yeah,
happen. So the first
this
thing
is
I
the
do
time.
is just kind of, okay, there it is.
There it
There's the
is,
catastrophizing.
catastrophizing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
great. I have a name for it. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
doing that thing.
Yeah.
It gives you a little bit of space from the reality, feeling like it is the reality.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so you catch yourself doing it. You do a reality check. That's the second C.
Okay.
And so that is getting into your logical mind. It's using your prefrontal cortex instead of just your emotional reaction or your kind of falling back into that groove.
Okay.
And so doing a reality check is how likely for catastrophizing in particular, the helpful thought, the reality check is really logically how likely is this
Yeah.
kind of this most worst case scenario
Yeah.
situation going to happen?
So in this case, a reality check might be like, hey, airplanes crash very rarely. It's
Yeah,
very,
yeah.
very unlikely that this would happen.
It's
You
very
know.
unlikely. You can get statistical about it if you want, that
Hmm.
there's, what are actually the stats of commercial plane crashes?
Hmm.
What is this airline's kind of history in terms of safety?
Uh-huh.
All of that can be really helpful for the logical mind to balance out what's going on in terms of this gravitational pull.
To the catastrophe, to the
Yeah,
worst case
to the
scenario.
worst case scenario,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So
Yeah.
curious about that. Okay, so then you check it, and you can use kind of nerdy like logic, information, data
Yes.
there.
Yeah. Prefrontal cortex is
Uh-huh.
engaged,
Yeah.
it's doing its helpful job.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I'm thinking about right now in relationship to checking it is I've been getting interested, as you know, in polyvagal theory and just the idea that
Hmm.
maybe you could check it by being like, oh, what if I'm just safe right now? What if I reaffirm that I'm actually
Nice.
safe? So it's not a
Yeah.
logical thing, but I go
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the tonality of my nervous system and just go,
Mm.
seems like you're feeling unsafe. You're seeing a picture of unsafety. Remember that safety is
Hmm.
there, safety is possible.
That's
Um,
beautiful. I really
mm,
like that. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, and in that you can source the present moment too. That, in this moment I am safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another check, right?
Hmm.
of checking the time perspective or the time frame that like, oh, even though that is a remote possibility, it's actually not happening right now.
It's not happening right now.
Yeah,
No.
and yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's when I get into difficult thoughts. I think that's part of the dance for me is the loss of perspective of like, oh, that's going to happen soon,
Hmm.
right? Or it's
Yeah.
happening now just because I'm thinking about it, and it's not.
Yeah. Totally.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So the third step in the three C's is to change the thought. So that would be to come up with a helpful thought. Sometimes that can include an action plan.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, another, one of the thoughts that I can have is like, oh, I haven't heard from someone that I care about, so I can immediately gravitate towards they're in danger, something bad has happened to them. And so I would, name that as catastrophizing. I would get logical, which really helps me to really think about, I've had this fear before. It hasn't turned out that way. Most likely that person is fine. And then when you come to the change it part, you can, come up with that helpful thought and also an action plan. If I haven't heard from them in half an hour, I'm going to check in with the friend who they're driving with.
Mm-hmm.
I'll send a text, and that can be just helpful and reassuring, as you know, when it comes to stress, to have some sense of agency, some
Yeah.
sense of like what I can do in order to mitigate the stress that I'm feeling now.
Right, because when you're in the catastrophe thought, there's really not a lot that you can actually do except be run by that, oh, this could happen, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah. So
it can be very disempowering. I suppose that's part of the negativity of the experience of a habitual thought is actually the loss of agency. So let's keep that in mind as we go through some of the other ones.
sure.
What
Yeah.
happens to agency in relationship to the
Hmm.
thoughts? Should we dive into? Oh, you're going to say there was a fourth C that you've been thinking about before we
Well,
start
yeah,
talking about.
I don't even know if we got to figure out how to connect it to, starting with a C, but it is investigating the part,
Mm-hmm.
what, and looking at it from a little bit of a parts perspective. Like, what is this gravitational pull, this particular habit, this part of me? What is it? What job is it trying to do for me? What's it trying to help with?
Yeah.
So maybe you have a little
Well,
alliteration
yeah. Well, there's the
addition.
curiosity, which is part of the internal family
Perfect.
systems. There's also, of course, you're connecting with it more deeply as a part, and
Yes,
then
beautiful. Yeah.
clarifying its role, right?
Yeah.
So we're just jumping into
Great.
IFS a little bit, but we'll get there more. Um,
Yeah.
so let's talk about a few of the others.
I feel like one that, especially for young people, that I find is kind of a developmental stage as well as a thinking habit that can, perpetuate throughout our lives is the mind reading habit. And this is the one where we kind of assume that other people are thinking about us negatively or judging us, and which may or may not be true, you know, in the moment. So again, when it comes to what's really important, I think about all of these thinking habits is you're not convincing yourself it's absolutely not true, because the mind doesn't actually work well in those binaries. And when it comes to anxiety, it's not helpful for your anxiety to just counter it, because it's going to say, for the catastrophizing example, if you say that's definitely not going to happen, that the plane is going to crash, you're going to say, well, there's that 0.1% chance, or whatever it is that it will, and that could be me. So just, having just looking at what, in this case, when it comes to a mind reading habit, looking at what else could be going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit of benefit of the doubt almost that you're adding in, sprinkling in to your perception of, are those people over there, they're all laughing. I walked into the room and they all start kind of laughing, and a couple of them look over at me. Is that, is it definitely true that they are judging me and ridiculing me? There's a possibility,
Mm-hmm.
but what else could be going on here?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that's another good poignant example. Is there anything you want to say about that one?
Yeah, I do. in terms of agency, that's an interesting idea, right? Because we said we track agency around mind reading, and I'm a little bit curious if it's a way to have agency. Like, oh, if I'm prepared, that maybe that will help me respond better. I'll know how to handle
Totally.
myself better.
Yeah,
So maybe that's actually an attempt at agency more than a loss of
absolutely.
agency.
Yeah, yeah, I can't, it's kind of like a misguided attempt at agency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also see like a benefit to it of trying to like figure out, because this gets into a thing that I'm interested in, which is evolution and part of the theory of mind. And so I
Hmm.
see it as kind of an exercise of theory of mind. One of the things that distinguishes humans from other species of animals or other beings is our ability to place ourselves in multiple levels of theory of mind. So I might be able to understand in our family system, for instance, how you think about Abby's thinking about you.
Hmm.
Right. And so
Great.
that ability to have that perception, Abby's our oldest daughter,
Hmm.
to have that perception of understanding and that insight. So
Yeah.
I could also see it as kind of when you say developmental, looking at it from that lens of really starting to
Hmm.
expand out of, I'm just safe with mom and dad or family, or maybe I'm
Hmm.
not safe with mom
Hmm.
and dad and family.
Yeah,
And I really need to figure out the social world a little bit more. And it
totally.
brings me into Bill Plotkin's The Nature of the Soul and that developmental
Hmm.
stage of having an authentic and socially acceptable self,
Hmm.
So I really do
Totally.
tie that in there. Mm.
Yeah, and how important belonging is in that phase, right? Like, and so we're heightened sense of like, where's a place that I might be being ostracized or cast out or not belonging.
Mhm.
And yeah, so developmentally, evolutionarily, just really
Mhm.
tracking where's my place here? Who are my people?
Mhm.
Do I feel connected?
It's interesting. We're in this spot because, in a way, I feel like I'm doing this work right now in my life at a certain level. I've been going through feelings of feeling like I'm not wanted, or kind of like looking at my life and being like, oh, as how do I say it? It's kind of hard because it's an emotion that's not fully understood yet inside me, but there is a little bit that it's theory of mind where I look like, oh, I miss things. Oh, I'm not seeing the way somebody saw me. So I do feel like
Hmm.
it's a little bit of like recovery of mind reading, or a little bit of recovery of
Hmm.
like, what's the real perception going on?
Yeah,
How,
yeah,
I've wanted to be accepted, but is it really happening? And kind of like
yeah.
testing out my theory of mind. And I'm not really trying to mind read people because it doesn't impact me as much. I'm not as insecure about being by myself or finding myself alone.
Hmm.
But the idea of getting a better theory of mind and the thought
Hmm.
patterns around trying to support that. So next time
Hmm.
I'm there,
Hmm.
I'm gonna catch it, I'm
Hmm.
gonna check
Check
it,
it,
and then I'm gonna change it
change it.
and maybe get more curious. But that maybe we'll even
Yeah,
get
yeah,
more
yeah.
curious about it today.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. I wonder if the curiosity maybe would come before the change too. That seems a little bit more intuitive, actually.
I agree
Yeah,
with you. Yeah.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
other thing I wanted to say about like the developmental piece of mind reading is that there's what you're saying in terms of, tracking our place in the community.
Yeah.
And then there's also the self-consciousness of like, it is the time of life where I need to be focused on myself. I'm developing myself. I'm figuring out who I am. I'm trying on new things. So that level of self-awareness, self-consciousness is also about looking inside and developing a sense of self.
And that ties into just honoring that developmental phase for you. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, good. Good. So if we were
Hmm.
to flip mind reading into a positive, like, and have
Hmm.
exercise a theory of mind,
Yeah.
um, you know, is there anything that comes to mind? You have any thoughts about that? Uh,
About the positive
yeah, the
frame of it.
developmental
Yeah.
positive. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that's positive about it in terms of, both what we're saying, both of these angles of, it's important to develop a sense of self as an adolescent and looking within. And then it's also makes sense that as we're trying to belong and fit into the tribe beyond nuclear family and kind of branching out, that we care about how people perceive us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's both like a tender thing and a pragmatic, mathematical, evolutionary thing, which I've talked about in other
Hmm.
podcasts, but just the idea that there's always an energetic math under all human behaviors. And not to
Yeah.
reduce it, but it's just there. It's just part of it.
Hmm.
It's the benefits
Hmm.
of caring.
Yeah.
Let's roll through some of these other ones.
Sure. So the all or nothing habit is the kind of black and white perfectionist thinking,
Mm,
that people could get into. I think this one is also pretty common, especially with people who tend towards more of an A-type
yeah,
personality.
control is the word that comes up
Yeah.
with that. You know, the benefit of
Yeah.
control.
Yeah. And it's really characterized by this very binary sense of like, I'm either one way or the other. I'm either all good or all bad.
Mhm.
There's no like gray area or kind of spectrum in between. There,
Mhm.
yeah, control, rigidity. It's like it has to be one way or it's all
Yeah,
ruined.
it's pretty extreme, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is extreme and very, very common.
Mm-hmm.
Very common that people get into because there's something very, very simple and satisfying by thinking in black and white terms too.
Yeah.
So,
Arguably, it's a little immature as well, in the sense
yeah,
of that part of maturity is holding the tension of opposites, right?
yeah,
That holding complex
absolutely.
paradoxes is part of
Yeah.
the developmental process.
Yeah, it goes along with, those wise philosophical statements like the more I learn, the less I know. And,
Hmm.
I was working with Gordon Neufeld and he talked about exactly what you said of like becoming a more mature person is actually being able to hold nuance, ambiguity, gray area more and more. So there is definitely a psychological maturity that goes along with that capacity. And so with this black and white thinking, it can be the helpful thought. Each of these have their own kind of helpful thought.
Hmm.
And on our social media platform, I will be sharing what each of those helpful thoughts are.
Great.
But this one is like, let's look at the whole picture. Let's look at this on a spectrum, you know. So a classic one is like, if I don't get all A's, then I'm a failure. And
Hmm.
so looking at it on a spectrum is like, ooh, well, getting a B could actually be a motivator for me. It's like I have something to learn. How cool is that? Still, I'm not all arrived in a perfect state, but I might have actually some growth to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the feeling I have with the black and white one, is that it's a very limiting, constricting frame, and that there is
Yeah.
a lot of, nuance, as you said, the word spectrum, and there's a kind of with black and white thinking opening out of it, is there is I guess I get into this vision inside my mind of the plenitude of life. There's kind of
Hmm.
like an abundance of diversity, an
Mm,
abundance of like
totally.
unknown, unfolding opportunity, and which is exciting. And if it,
Yeah.
yeah, mm, okay, keep
Yeah.
going.
Well, let's talk about this one. We can come back if you want, but I think
Yeah,
this one really goes well with parts. The it's easy with catastrophizing to feel like, oh, in psychology, there's this idea of ego syntonic and ego dystonic. Okay, so
okay,
syntonic is like it's in alignment with who I am. Dystonic is it's not in alignment. It's easy with catastrophizing to feel like it's not in alignment with, how I want to think. Whereas with perfectionism and kind of aiming high, it can feel very ego syntonic. It can kind of feel like I like that. I like that I have high standards. I like that I really want to be the best version of myself. This can really go along with eating disordered behavior too, which is one of the mental health disorders that is tends to be ego syntonic. Like there's a lot that people like about having that sense of control and achievement. And so when we look at it as a part, there's a part of us, the perfectionist, maybe we call it the perfectionist part, just to be simple. It could be way more nuanced than that. That there is, it's like, how can we look at, well, what does that part want for me? What job is that part doing? And it might be, that it wants me to be my best self. It wants me to, be very successful in life. And so it's a good one to kind of just illustrate how that part could be really going for something important for you. And then again, in parts, it's kind of parts work. We're looking at, well, how's that working for your whole system? How's that? Are there any other parts of you who might take issue with, really being focused on achievement?
Right. Good. Okay. So one of the things that I think, just to introduce people who aren't familiar with parts work or the internal family systems model, is the idea that we have subparts of our personality. There's multitudes rather than we're just a singularity of ego structure,
Hmm.
right? And I think that one of the things I would also say is that, the black and white perfectionist could also be a protector, to be mindful that in the internal family systems model, sometimes parts take on protective roles. So it's not just about the success, but it's also the fear of the pain or the avoidance of the pain that comes along if
Yes,
I'm not a success,
of course. Yeah,
right? So,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And
and
so
what you're
that's
the way
where yeah, go
and the
ahead.
way you're saying it a little bit is
Hmm.
like you're talking about the optimal part of seeing when the part is freed from the fear of the pain, what it's really trying to do at its best version. But it's also sometimes important, or oftentimes it's almost always important, to look at protectors in terms of trying to who they're trying to help in the system that's more vulnerable, or
Yes,
that's in our unconscious or subconscious.
absolutely. Yeah. So that's a deeper dive into the parts model, is going into the transformational aspect of it, where, protectors working really hard because they feel like if they're not doing that job, then, that usually younger, more vulnerable part would be hurt again. And so if we can work with that younger part and realize that there's now a self here who can actually take care of it, that frees up that protector to not be as extreme in its role.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, this is a good illustration of the model in a very simplified way.
The other thing I want to name that first came up when you started to talk about the perfectionist and that feeling good, and you went towards the food disorder issues, but I thought about like a lot of like new spirituality, where people
Mm,
feel like they're really like there's just a sense of like, oh, I have a lot of this agency, I have a lot of this like empowered
mm, mhm,
dynamics, and
mhm,
it's like a high vision, it's like this high level of imagining one's life, and I saw that, and I think,
mhm,
oh, that's oftentimes in there. At least that's how I
mhm.
I judge that those
Yeah,
behaviors.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I have similar judgers coming, yeah, that come in like when you see more new age spirituality stuff around maybe manifesting, that like if you
Yes.
just kind of focus your thoughts on something positive,
Mhm.
then
I
and
can be
there's
in
something
control of
very,
this.
I
Yeah.
can be in control, and there's something very simplistic and kind of black and white about, yeah, the just thinking about something
And I can be at my best
makes
self,
it true. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Thank God for Carl Jung. Okay, so let's get into a few more of the thought patterns.
Okay.
Here, yeah.
So there's the I can't habit. It's just automatically concluding that you're not capable of something. This is, usually something that feels challenging that you're looking towards.
Question on
And
that one.
yeah,
Is that the same as I don't deserve? Is like I
well,
can't because I don't deserve, or is there a different one for that?
I would say this is different. And
Okay.
there's none in here that really correlate with I don't deserve.
Mhm.
Um, this is a little bit more like the automatic conclusion. It's more resistance. It's like I don't want to do that, and so that I can't comes in,
Yeah.
or I have some form of resistance to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm going to gravitate towards I can't, very certain that I'm not able to do that. So the
S-
helpful thought for that one is I can try this.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's super helpful. I could
Yeah.
try. Yeah. I can
We can try this.
experiment.
Yes.
Or how about
Yeah.
there's many ways to try this.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Like flexibility. Like, oh yeah, we
Flexibility.
could I could do it my way
Yeah.
maybe. I could try my way, see if it works.
Yeah. Totally.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd be really curious as we go along which you resonate with, because I think I have a sense of.
Okay. Let's do it. Let's do a quiz. We'll go through them and
Yeah, yeah,
then
yeah.
you tell me and I'll tell you if you're right.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Zooming in on the negative. So this is kind of going back into the past, something that happened that might have felt embarrassing or uncomfortable in a situation, and all you can think about is that particular embarrassing or uncomfortable feeling and not see
Hmm.
the whole picture
Hmm.
of what happened.
Hmm.
So, yeah, maybe there was, like someone that you said something to at a party that you were like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that thing. It was so embarrassing. And that you can't get that out of your mind. The other person most likely is not thinking about it as much as you are. Sometimes it
Yeah.
feels good to go back and kind of clean those things up, and sometimes it's just you gravitating towards zooming in on the negative. And as you look at the bigger picture of what was going on at the party and all the other interactions that you had and the really funny joke that you told as well, it soothes the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And there doesn't really feel like there's that same acute need to talk to the person and
What's the
check in
helpful
about.
thought with zooming in on the negative?
Is let's look at the whole picture.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. So the I should, you should
Mm.
is this kind of rigid and unreasonable rules about how other people should behave or how you should behave in a particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's people that have, kind of heavy social norms. They're heavy on the social norms of like, you should not have done that, or, this is how friends behave. And
Mm-hmm.
there's something that feels rigid around
Yeah.
it and
Yeah.
protective. Obviously, there's strong protectors there that are
Yeah.
coming in. Yeah.
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 Mhm.
So the
Okay.
the helpful thought for this one is, wouldn't it be nice if, or I would prefer if,
Oh yeah.
which is really nice and softening, I feel like.
So
It's like I have a preference. It's okay to have a preference,
yeah.
that
Yeah.
people write me a thank you letter or whatever it is, but
Mm.
just away from like it has to be this way. And
Mm.
other people need to play by that rules, or I need to, I have to be this kind of friend to everybody.
No, it's good. I you tuned into what I felt. It was like, oh, say the first one again. Wouldn't it be nice if?
Wouldn't it be nice if,
Yeah.
or I would prefer if.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's so disarming,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
the the armoring of it has to be this way. You should do that, and just that strong protector of. Is this also? Is
Yeah.
this? It kind of reminds me of the black and white rigidity.
Yeah, there is a similar rigidity. I
Yeah.
have a resonance in my body when I talk about this one, and it's definitely like in my gut. It's a little bit more people need to play by my rules. It's almost like a playground, like people aren't doing it right kind of
Okay.
feeling,
Yeah.
or, I'm not doing it right. And the other one, the perfectionism, black and white, is feels a little bit more heady ideal to
Yeah.
me.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's that agency idea, and it's almost like a reach for agency. Like if I feel out of my comfort zone with how things are going, I can establish, some shoulds in here for myself and others in order to
Hmm.
build that safety,
Yeah.
that protection of the system. Mm.
All right. So the last ones are the fortune telling habit. So it's, looking to the future a little bit like, okay.
Did you know that was coming?
I was doing some fortune telling that might get noisy around here. And it did. It got noisy. Fortune telling habit. And this is kind of projecting into the future, kind of like catastrophizing. But instead of going to the worst case scenario, you're looking at something that's coming up and assuming that you're not going to perform well, you're not going to do well, you're not going to like something. It's kind of just gravitating towards the future event is going to
Mm-hmm.
be a disappointment. It's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more like a less catastrophe, more disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the helpful thought
Let's
for
get an
this one.
example of that. Let's go into that one. I think,
Okay.
we could look at our relationship and the way social events and like you're like, hey, let's do this. I'm like, nah, I don't want to do that. As kind of I'm kind of seeing that's
Yeah.
not going to be right. And then oftentimes I'm wrong,
Uh-huh.
so I kind of have a
Yeah, yeah,
predictive. I
yeah.
hear the fortune telling is being
Yeah.
predictive.
Yeah, great.
That
So you gravitate towards this one maybe yourself.
no, it's not my strongest one, but I will say I recognize it and wanted to illustrate it.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so but in this case it's like not looking into like what could be predictive, open-minded. It's a negatively valent or negatively
Hmm.
associated outcome with the
Yeah.
fortune telling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
helpful thought is
The helpful thought is I'll look before I leap. So I'll look at all, it's kind of similar to the zooming in on the negative and looking at the whole picture, and it's looking future towards, okay, I'll look at the pieces here before I jump to the conclusion that it's going to
yeah.
be a negative experience.
Yeah. I'm really seeing the connection between agency, loving agency, and the helpful thoughts. Like that
Yeah.
feels really like, oh, look before I leap. That's such a confidence builder. It's such a like,
Yeah.
I can trust myself builder. It's really cool. Love this.
Totally.
Let's
Yeah.
stop for a minute and let's just acknowledge the people who wrote this book. I don't know if we did.
Yeah.
So
No, we
let's make
didn't.
sure that we know. Yeah.
Yep. Totally. I'm going to show the book here. Hopefully it won't be backwards.
Nope, it's not.
Conquer Negative Thinking for Teens, relates to adults as well.
It's a workbook.
So it's a workbook. Mary Karapetian Alvord and Anne McGrath are the authors of the book.
Yeah. Big credit to them for doing the work. And then
Yes.
let's talk about the family of model that this is in. Is this in the DBT or CBT realm?
This
So
is in
give
the
people a little.
CBT, yeah, the CBT realm of cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is the cognitive side of cognitive behavioral therapy. So,
Great.
that you can kind of become aware of your thinking habits, that you can, make adjustments in that, have a sense of agency.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So the last two are the blaming habit. This is, you might recognize this one in your wife sometimes, of like the automatic conclusion of like, who did that? Who did that thing? Brene Brown tells a great story about her husband, coming down and oh gosh, I don't remember the story clearly, but I've used it as an illustration.
Do your best.
Um, oh, I can't remember it.
Okay, we'll come
I'll
back
have
to it.
to. We'll come back to it. It's a
Okay,
really
yeah.
good story.
Good.
So yeah, the Brene Brown. So yeah, it's all their fault or it's all my fault, kind of defaulting to, you
Yeah.
know, the blame of, again, agency, putting agency on someone else. Someone else did something, or it's all me.
I definitely I mean I think I worked through that one a while ago, but I know for a while I would blame other people for my emotions. It felt like a family practice of like oh, if I have a hard
Hmm.
feeling, it's somebody else's fault, And
Right.
then that was probably when we went to the Chiricahuas, and I was like really saw that pattern in myself. That was about 2010 maybe, and
Uh-huh.
saw the pattern of, oh, I have this thing. If I have a hard emotion, my reflex there, I'm gonna say I kind of learned it from my dad more than my mom, of getting mad or getting upset that somebody else is responsible for me having
Right.
this emotion. And so my commitment to
Totally.
myself at that point was like, oh no, the emotions are mine. I need to be responsible for my emotional experience.
Yeah,
And
yeah, totally.
so
Yes,
still
yeah.
working on it, but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Totally. Yeah. So I'm sort of remembering the Brene Brown story. So there's, Brene Brown tells the story about coming downstairs, having a really tough morning and nothing's going right. And she starts to tell her husband, like, and where were you? And how come you decided to go, swimming this morning for such a long time? And he, I think, just kind of walked out of the room, and it was like she was there left with herself of like, here she was having a hard time and projecting on her husband, and the just owning that, having to look in the mirror a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can relate to that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right.
I'm not going to say
And
anything about our relationship right now.
you're just glad I'm having that awareness. Yeah. And then the last one is that it's not fair. This one I get is a little more ambivalent to me because the we can people can get into a habit of just feeling like nothing's fair. It's almost like maybe an Eeyore kind of like, this is nothing's fair. Why do these things keep happening to me? Or, siblings, it comes up with siblings a lot, like in terms of like being treated equally or fairly. And I think there is, something, maybe there's that distinction between being treated equally and fairly, because being treated equally just doesn't seem like actually a reasonable expectation. But fairness seems somewhat reasonable to me. So I don't always find myself really resonating, but I know there's an extreme place here where people can get into just maybe a mindset of, things are not fair and I'm not treated fairly.
Got a couple things to say. First, I want to circle back to what's the helpful thought for blaming.
The helpful thought for blaming, let me look it up here. I don't use that one as much, is this is a bummer. How can I respond to it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
And then what's the helpful thought for the it's not fair?
The helpful thought for it's not fair is it is what it is.
Yeah. You could also use the same helpful thought. Oh, it's a bummer. What can I do about it, right?
Yeah.
I kind of like that a little better. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about it's not fair. I'm thinking about my teenage self a little bit, and just that feeling of like, it's hard to feel, your practice adult, if you're lucky, somebody's honoring you as, an autonomous being with your own thoughts and feelings, if you're lucky, if you have a good support system or a cool school system. Otherwise you're becoming of age and you're not quite getting your validation, and, like the not fairness of it. Plus we know how schoolyards can be. And there's also a lot of not fairness in terms of how young people, at least, in our generation, at least schools I went to, there's fairness, but there was a lot of not fairness too. So I can kind of see that, that adolescent phase is maybe having that a little bit more intensely.
Maybe. Yeah.
And I can also see the negative thought of the default mode of just the disempowerment of agency, of it's not fair. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually it's kind of like a lot of political stuff too, a lot of, it's not fair when people who have power do things, or, so I see a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah. We can resonate with that more.
Okay. So
emotionally.
what is the ones you think I am? What are the thoughts you think I gravitate towards?
I think you gravitate towards the I can't.
Really?
Yeah, but maybe it's a little bit more of the fortune telling version.
Okay. You want to give an example that's not too exposing?
Well, I think the party one, like going to an event, so maybe it is more fortune telling, but like you are like, yeah, and I'm not going to enjoy that. It's like I'm not going to have fun. It's kind of assuming that it's going to be a disappointment, or you're not going to feel good in it. So yeah, maybe it is more of the fortune telling. That's the main one.
What do you
resonate with?
Not the least, but that's not the dominant one.
Yeah. What do you resonate with?
I mean, that might be more like a behavioral limitation, like a protector. It's like, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that. And but I think underneath is, I think I tend to focus on the negative. I think I tend to do that. And
like zooming in on the negative, the past.
Zooming in on the negative, zooming in and holding those things, and a little bit of playing with the mind reading around that. But yeah, I think that's my, to go to IFS language, probably my primary protector. And it's interesting, in some of my clients, I've also been mirroring that, and they've been working with their zooming in on the negative experiences as well. So let's turn it towards
Can
IFS a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Sounds
totally. I
good.
think that's
Yep.
great. Yeah. So what do you know about that as a protector in terms of what does it want for you?
Yeah. I have done some work with it, and the criticism part of me, the self-critic. I don't really think of it as that, but, and I think I've worked through a lot of self-criticism at a certain level, but then sometimes I like look at my mind. I'm like, oh no, you got criticism going on. You got self-criticism going on. Um, and it's subtle. It's like not as overt as it was when I was young. But what I really found out, which you kind of said earlier with maybe the black and white thinking, was this one wanted success. This one
Mm,
really, really wants me to be successful. And what I also
mhm.
find with parts, particularly the ones when they show up negative and then they get the opportunity to restructure or reorganize, is a lot of them just want to learn skills that they didn't learn.
Absolutely.
Right. A lot of
Yeah,
them want to have the agency or the
totally.
confidence or the
Yeah.
capacity of like, oh, how can
Hmm.
I be in conflict or be with someone in
Hmm.
conflict on the soccer field? Yes,
Totally.
you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Whoa. Okay, that's intense. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
gonna move.
Okay, sounds good.
So we were talking about your protector of wanting you to succeed.
Yeah, that's right. Like self-critic. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
hmm And I was mentioning that underneath that is usually parts usually want to learn skills. You know, they usually
Yeah.
want to
Right.
transform. So let's talk a little bit about not so much. I mean, we could talk about my parts, but I don't think that's as interesting
Hmm.
as and applicable for people. It's really understanding the value of curiosity in relationship to their mind, right? Like
Hmm.
there's a
Totally.
value there that IFS teaches us about being curious about our thoughts rather than say get into a polarity with them or try to push them
Hmm.
down or manage them or
Totally.
organize them,
Yeah.
that we can actually in the
Yeah.
moment open up to our system and listen to our system by breaking the assumption that we are a single
Yeah.
thing and start listening to our subparts. So
Yeah.
what's your
Yeah.
response to
Cool.
that?
My
Yeah.
response is multi-layered to that. One is that it really opens up this conversation of like we're talking about thinking, which in a way is like the tip of the iceberg, but the relationship between emotions and thoughts and how parts relate to that, I think is very rich. So we're talking about these thinking habits that often have a relationship in terms of, I would say the majority of these thinking habits have a relationship with anxiety. Maybe not, maybe blaming would be a little bit more anger. It's not fair, tends, towards anger that I can't. But otherwise it's like there are ways, there are protectors that are kind of in a way managing fear and anxiety. And so that we can understand that, okay, I've got this part that, is trying to manage fear in a particular way by projecting into the future, of what could go wrong, by going over what happened in the past so I can be more successful in the future,
Right.
and so the connection with our unconscious and the more conscious thoughts that are in collaboration with our feelings are protectors for those feelings. So that's
Yeah,
one
no,
thing
that's
I want to
good.
say about it.
Yeah, no, I like that because it turns the focus from, oh, what are my thought patterns to what are my strategies for dealing with fear and anxiety?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so part of the curiosity could be like, and this is, do I like the way I'm dealing with my fear and anxiety? Right. That's kind of
Hmm.
almost an IFS type question. How does this strategy, this part that's doing it through catastrophizing, is that really working for it? Or is it really
Hmm.
working for me or how I'm experiencing it?
Hmm.
Use the answer is like yes and no. Like, yeah, it's good because I know I can count on it, but no, there's lots of,
Yeah.
secondary problems that happen with it. Right. So then
Yeah.
the question becomes, in terms of change is
Hmm.
and dealing with that is like, how do we deal with anxiety and what's the role and function of
Hmm.
anxiety, which is actually something I think lives
Mm.
very close to stress and stress intelligence.
Hmm.
So from your
Totally.
perspective, what
Yeah.
is, as a psychotherapist who's got spiritual roots and spiritual
Hmm.
practices, like
Hmm.
what's your take on anxiety and living with anxiety and the function of thoughts and all that we're talking about right now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so easy, like I was saying with the catastrophizing, to kind of like you demonize, like, that you just, oh, I always think of the very worst thing. But evolutionarily, how important it is to be prepared for what could go wrong, to be actually thinking about what the eventualities are. And if you're prepared for the worst case scenario, you're actually evolutionarily a little bit more advantageous, as a viable organism. It's like, oh, I can think ahead, I can do some preparation for that. And of course, and you and I've talked about this before, that it gets to the point where, it becomes at the very extreme paralyzing. You can't do anything because of what could go wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
Or
but
extreme, let me just add in quick,
yeah,
extreme could also just be toxic, living in a toxic
yeah,
soup of anxiety. Yeah, yeah,
totally,
yeah.
totally. Yeah. Yeah. So I really like, the doing some reframing, that also the brain is predictive. So we just are going to have a tendency to think about what's coming. Um, and some people more than others, some people might actually rehash the past more, but a lot of people do gravitate towards thinking about what's coming. And there's something very natural about that. Um, and, I liked what you said in terms of like our anxiety wants us to be successful. And I'm just trying to tune into, I've been working with my anxiety actually quite a lot lately,
Okay.
and realizing the subtleties of my anxiety, and how there's a very much a control piece of, like, thinking, if I don't think my way through this, then it's not going to be taken care of and I won't be okay.
Okay.
Just that very subtle sense of agency again, in some way, or control, or like,
Yeah.
I've got this, I
Yeah.
can do this. And how, from a spiritual perspective, just the kind of softening back from that control and trusting life, and feeling like I've been noticing the subtlety of my mind recently, and how, I will think about an upcoming event and my preference, even just my preference. It's not necessarily that it's going to be, the worst case scenario, but just a subtle preference of, like, gosh, I hope it's not foggy when I go to the beach. And what it's like to just kind of accept life on its own terms, that sometimes it works out like you want it to, but it always just works out. And
Helpful
just,
thought, right? That's like a helpful
yeah,
thought.
it is a
What's that
very,
thing?
for me,
Yeah.
it
What's that
is a
thinking
very,
pattern you identify? You're just talking about, like, I have to, is that the fortune telling one? Or is that my,
yeah, I would say that's probably fortune telling. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
so I
Okay.
am more of a future oriented thinker, and whether it's catastrophizing or
Yeah.
fortune telling, and just having preferences. And I think it's just very human to
Yeah.
have, like, this is how I want things to go. This is my sense. And there's this sense of control that goes with that, that
Yeah.
we are this, um, this individual organism that has some say in how things go. And that is important. Like, I can acknowledge the importance and the naturalness of that in this form, this biological form, with
Right.
a brain that we need to budget for and take care of, and, a body that we need to protect.
Yeah.
And from a spiritual perspective, to loosen the control, and to trust and meet life on its own terms, and accept, that 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 things are unfolding, and in just the right way. And that little
Yeah.
phrase, I think we had it on our refrigerator for a while, of like, things will work out in the end. If they haven't worked out, it's not the end. And there's something, sort of Pollyannish about that, but there's also something very, very trusting and true about, life is unfolding, and we can soften into that.
That's beautifully said. I really like it. And I like that, that's your current practice. That's your conversation with yourself. And I really see the relationship between being able to name negative thought patterns, catch them, work with them. And then the IFS model is really giving some skills in relationship to this human experience, and particularly the anxiety part, right? So that's kind of like, you identified at the core of it. And, for me, the anxiety lesson was always studying for my exams as an acupuncturist and having the board test in the state of California. And it's 28 at the time. And I was like, I would feel anxious. And then if I studied, my anxiety would go away. And then I realized my anxiety was just trying to tell me, hey, bro, it's time to get focused here. Right. And that I
Nice.
could
Yeah.
listen to my body and I could trust my anxiety. So
Yeah.
all these kind of adaptive emotions, right? And I will say, just to put a plug, is normally I've been celebrating like the level of intensity of our predictive minds and the way we deal with stress and the thoughts about it. But I've been doing a little deeper studies of some Taoist stuff and looking at the Taoist imagination of, many thousands of years ago, and really kind of getting a sense of like, oh, I'm carrying a heavy load in my mind more than I need to be. And so at one level, I have the story of, okay, evolution gave us all these adaptive thought capacities to help us, right? And so there's all these different strategies where we can think, and we can look into the future and predict. We can see what's the right way or not the right way to be included or excluded. We can imagine what the worst case scenario might be if we go down that road towards the neighboring tribe. Like we could do all these kind of things. And then there's that deep quietude, that deep mystery, that deep presence, which I think you're calling the mysterious, or the mystery, or the spirituality. I would say more like the mysterious. David Hinston calls it like the loom of origins, right? That organic connective tissue of the cosmos to which we belong. And I think making that move is also, seems to me, very helpful for kind of checking what we expect our normal set point of anxiety and thought is. And I think that's
Nice.
always been the wisdom of the, particularly probably yogic systems too, and the Ayurvedic systems, but the East, the Chinese, the Taoist practices of, there is a deep stillness and that watercourse way. So I just want to add that in, that, I kind of like our modern condition, but I also think maybe there's a softer ground in which we live, where anxiety and overthinking don't predominate as much as they do for us.
Beautiful. Yeah. What is it? The loom of
The loom of
creation?
origins. The
Loom
loom
of
of origin.
origins. Wow, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing this arc of, maybe, your own evolutionary journey, and I feel like you and I are in tandem in a lot of ways. I've really loved how you have turned towards the human condition in your study, in your practice. And you very much have like a body-based medicine that you've devoted yourself to and practiced, and your whole perspective on stress, moving away from everything that's so transcendental in our orientation in terms of teachings in the world, whether it's spirituality or even mindfulness practices that can be about getting out of your human condition, and how you've faced the human condition more. And then just this subtlety that's happening of maybe getting into a more integrative place of yes and, with the human condition, and just expanding into the loom of origins. And yeah,
Yeah,
so
no, it's good because, and it's true, and I think you're right. And if I was to get really honest about it, there is a kind of, just going down that road, there's kind of a nihilism, or a kind of annihilation, or a kind of like, oh, I'm just my biology, that
mhm,
is very intense. It's like, and it actually misses something fundamental. I think at a certain level, there's part of me that believes it, that there's a finiteness to life, and there's that, but there's this other thing I've been, and the Taoist has been helped me tune into, and my own fear of like, oh, it's an abyss. And it's like,
mhm.
no, that's actually a part that thinks it's an abyss. And it's the part that's really identified with just the body as the I.
Yeah.
And so opening up to, okay, yeah, there's a lot out there besides this body that's
Yeah.
holding this space of reality. I know I sound
Yeah.
like I'm from California, but that's been a helpful just adjustment to kind of trust the larger tissue of reality, and
Mm.
not feel like I'm just a separate alone body in that, as much as
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate the experience of that. So
Yeah, that's
um
cool.
yeah, and I kind of want to see, and it might be a bridge too far
Yeah.
right now, but I want to
Yeah.
reach towards this idea that, like, the language of astrology is a way
Mm-hmm.
for us to
That's right.
talk about these parts, right? Is a way to
Mm.
talk about these
Talk about
evolved
the
things.
loom of origins too, right? We're
Yeah.
part of a cosmos that includes, some planetary bodies that may have some influence on us.
Yeah. And at least the archetypal narrative is helpful,
Yeah,
right? At
at
least the
least.
archetypal narrative, at least,
Yeah.
it may not be predictive, it may not define everything, but at least it kind of gives some
Yes.
gravitas to certain elements in
Totally.
our lives
Yeah.
in different ways. So
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of, yeah.
Cool. I'm excited
S-
to expand into that a little bit. So, yeah. So do you have an entry point with it? I mean,
well,
I
I'm
do.
not
I have a little bit of
yeah.
one.
Okay. I'll let you go for it, but my sense is maybe it's a bridge too far, that we should probably just stick and
Sure.
save the astrology for another time, unless you have a counterpoint on that.
Well, let's just see. Yeah, let's see where it goes and if there's anything to it.
Okay. Okay, good.
Um, I mean, what you're just talking about in terms of materialism and focusing on our biological condition just feels very Saturnian in a way to me,
Yes.
and so, the earthiness, mediating the physical reality. So I don't know if there's more to say about that now, but there's definitely, and you are a Capricorn, so that
I
fits.
think that's a really good reflection. And I was concerned about getting too deep into astrology, but I think it ties nicely to both thoughts, IFS parts, and spirituality, which we were talking about. And so, yeah, that a good take on that is materialism. And I think a lot of that work has been honoring the Saturn energy, or the Capricorn, or the Earth as a fundamental rock at which we need to understand what it means to be on this water rock, right? And know how to do
Yeah.
that and what it means. And so the evolutionary story has given me a kind of a concrete way of understanding human nature, right? Based in the substance of the ground up from the earth, where, I've been getting more interested in honoring Jupiter, which is the other big planet, and it's about its expansion. And so it kind of like, I'm like, oh yeah, what I just said about my migration, in which you reflected around about spirituality, is definitely also can be seen through the language of Saturn and Jupiter. But more
Hmm.
importantly, what I think that really says is, one way of thinking about astrology or archetypes is that we need to have we need to have parts, we need to have parts in our system that honor the archetypes. So I need to
Hmm.
have a part of me that knows how to deal with the earth, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. And I need a part of me that needs to understand and know how to expand and grow and learn and connect with the cosmos. It's,
Hmm.
rough,
Hmm.
rough description of Jupiter, but so yeah, that's
Yeah,
where I'd
yeah,
go
yeah.
with it.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So there's the
Mm.
elemental part of it, which I love, and how, each of the planets kind of represents a different element, each of the signs. And there's in that system four elements, and balancing out the elements. You and I both have a lot of air in our chart, and here we are having, mental conversations and rapport and ideas, the world of ideas. Um, and so that's really interesting to look at elementally. And we both have a very strong presence of Saturn in our astrology charts too. And so, embodiment and success and, like setting goals and taking steps towards climbing the mountain, which is, tends to be the more kind of Saturnian And also learning through hardship. When it comes to Saturn, there's the teaching element of like you've got lessons to learn, and you will get there. And there's no way to the destination except through the lessons and through the hardship and the grist for the
Mhm.
mill, so to
Mhm.
speak. And I just really feel the presence of that in my own life, how important that's been. Um, Saturn as a continued teacher.
Yeah, great. I love that.
Yeah. And there's a Saturn gets a hard rap in an astrological chart because it is learning through hardship. And um, I saw this great representation. I took some notes in an astrology class I took many years ago, a couple decades. And I just found them recently. And it was this perception that, it used to be in the old system, in the Hellenistic, I guess, astrological system, when you could only, there was only the visible sky. That there was that Saturn was the most far out of the planets that we could visibly see. And so there was this way in which it was the mediator between our planet and the cosmos, and that part of the melancholy that's attributed to Saturn is that it's feeling bound to this kind of inner system of our universe, but also is kind of reaching for a more cosmic, um, divine connection. And so that's a connection to the melancholy. There's a lot of good mythology around Saturn. And when it comes to negative thinking and gravitating towards negative thinking, I could see the role of Saturn in that too.
No, that's great. It's really good to honor Saturn. And my favorite book about that is by Liz Green. I think the title's just Saturn. Maybe a new look at an old devil is might be the subtitle. But and we could expand into religion and into attributions of the negative thinking, which oftentimes in a religious context go into Satan, the devil, that whole evil
Hmm.
world. And it's interesting to like look at that pre-Christian and look at Saturn as the figure there and kind of open up that more esoteric
Mm.
view on the human experience through that archetypal lens. So I think if people are struggling with that world and they're open to astrology and they're open to looking at it from a different angle, that could
Hmm.
be a resource for people. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's really nice to tie in this idea of our negative thought patterns as a Saturn encounter, right?
Hmm.
Like it
Yeah.
really is a Saturn encounter of like,
Hmm.
and what's Saturn trying to do? Deal with the fears and anxieties of, what it means to be on this planet and dealing with the hard lessons.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
well done there.
Yeah.
By the way, I love interviewing you. You're a great interview. You're so fun to talk with, and I know we have
Oh,
a multi-decade year rapport. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, Alice.
thank you, honey.
It's really
Yeah.
great to see, as we've been working together more with our little project, but also in this interview. Really great to see who you are in your professional life, which is, because you have a confidentiality agreement with your clients. It's not something I get to look into. I've been
Hmm.
really getting to see you as a wisdom holder and as just a bountiful, compassionate resource for people in their lives. So I
Oh,
honor that in you. And I know other
thank
people in
you.
the community do. So it's a beautiful thing you've done with your career.
Thank
So
you.
thank
It
you for
really
being on the
touches
show
me.
today.
Appreciate that. Okay. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'll be back.
Great. Yes, you will.
Yeah. Cool.